The air in New York City in 1862 was thick with the dust of industry and the whispers of war. The nation was tearing itself apart, brother against brother, and in the shadow of this immense conflict, strange things began to stir in the city's quieter corners. Amidst the bustling docks, the gas-lit streets, and the burgeoning financial districts, a darker current ran unseen. This was the era when spiritualism gained a foothold, when seances were parlor entertainment, and when the veil between worlds felt thinner than ever before. But what unfolded in a forgotten church on the Lower East Side was far beyond mere spiritualist theatrics. It was an undertaking so profound, so utterly devoted to a perversion of faith, that its echoes would resonate through generations. The men involved, the Ravencroft brothers, were not ordinary fanatics. They were influential figures, pillars of certain communities, men whose public faces belied a terrifying private devotion. They spoke of pain as purification, suffering as a pathway to divine understanding. Their rhetoric, cloaked in biblical terms, drew in a congregation seeking solace in a time of profound uncertainty. The promise, not salvation in the traditional sense, but a radical transformation, an unveiling of truth through extreme discipline. The church itself, an abandoned stone structure, had been acquired under dubious circumstances, its windows blacked out, its doors sealed against the prying eyes of a city too consumed by its own woes to notice. What transpired within those walls was a carefully orchestrated descent, a systematic stripping away of conventional reality, all under the guise of an ancient, forgotten rite. The meticulous records kept by one of the brothers, unearthed decades later, painted a chilling picture of an escalating series of practices, each designed to push the human mind and body to its absolute limits. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated steps in a terrifying process, a ritualistic journey into the heart of suffering. The journal entries, scrawled in a precise, almost clinical hand, detailed the early stages of what the Ravencrofts termed the cleansing of the vessel. It began subtly, with prolonged fasting and enforced silence, intended to break down the participants' connection to the material world. Members of the Brethren, drawn from various social strata but united by a shared sense of disillusionment and a yearning for deeper meaning, willingly submitted. They believed they were on the precipice of a great awakening, guided by men of profound spiritual insight. In the flickering candlelight of the sealed church, the Ravencrofts preached a gospel of radical self-denial, asserting that the physical body was merely a temporary prison, a hindrance to true enlightenment. They referenced obscure texts, whispered of forgotten Gnostic gospels, and pointed to symbols they claimed were older than Christianity itself. Interlocking circles, a single unblinking eye. These symbols, they insisted, were keys to unlocking higher states of consciousness, pathways to a brutal, undeniable truth. The city outside, meanwhile, continued its grim dance with the Civil War. News of battles, of victories, and crushing defeats filled the papers. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. The air was heavy with grief and fear, a fertile ground for any voice that promised an escape, a revelation beyond the mundane horror. The Ravencrofts exploited this perfectly, framing their cleansing not as an escape from suffering, but as a direct confrontation with it, a way to transcend the earthly pain by embracing a greater, purer agony. The congregation, increasingly isolated and dependent on the brothers' pronouncements, moved from fasting to more extreme forms of sensory deprivation. Hooded figures sat for days in absolute darkness, emerging disoriented, their minds primed for suggestion. The objective, as stated in the journal, was to unmake the self, to dissolve individual identity until only the collective consciousness of the brethren remained. But what entity, precisely, was this collective consciousness meant to serve? The journal offered chilling hints, oblique references to the architect and the true current. As the weeks turned into months, the rituals intensified, moving beyond mere deprivation to active inducement of pain. The Ravencrofts introduced practices that mirrored ancient flagellation rites, though with a distinctly American Gothic twist. They spoke of scouring the soul clean, of using physical agony to burn away the impurities of the modern world. The church, once a place of quiet contemplation, transformed into an echoing chamber of hushed moans and the rhythmic thud of self-inflicted discipline. Yet, the journal of Thomas Ravencroft, the younger and more meticulous brother, never portrayed these acts as cruel. Instead, he meticulously documented the spiritual breakthroughs that followed, describing visions, ecstasies, and profound insights reported by the participants. He genuinely seemed to believe they were guiding their flock toward a higher plane, even as the bodies grew gaunt and the minds became fragile. "The essence," he wrote on October 14, 1862, "is not the wound itself, but the focus it provides. The mind, when confronted with absolute sensation, ceases its idle chatter and opens itself to instruction. The architect's true language is sensation, raw and unfiltered." This philosophy, horrifying in its implications, was a perversion of any known spiritual tradition. It was a dark alchemy, attempting to transmute suffering into divine revelation. Meanwhile, the general public remained oblivious. A few neighbors might have noticed the blacked-out windows, the lack of activity, but in a city so vast and preoccupied, an abandoned church falling silent was hardly cause for alarm. The war raged on, demanding full attention. Casualties mounted, grief became a constant companion, and the public's capacity for shock was utterly consumed by news from the front lines. The Ravencrofts operated in this national blind spot, shielded by the larger tragedy unfolding across the country. But the nature of their experiments was about to shift dramatically, moving from self-inflicted pain to something far more sinister, something that required a deeper sacrifice. The entries in Thomas Ravencroft's journal began to hint at external purifications, a phase that would mark a horrifying turning point for the Brethren. The shift to external purifications marked the true descent into the macabre heart of the Ravencroft rituals. Thomas's journal, usually filled with philosophical musings on suffering, became disturbingly pragmatic. He began to detail the acquisition of new vessels, individuals brought into the church, not as willing participants, but as unwitting subjects for the next stage of their horrifying experiment. These weren't members of the Brethren, but rather the city's forgotten, the destitute, the orphaned, the dispossessed. In the chaos of wartime New York, where families were shattered and social structures strained, people simply vanished without a trace, their absence swallowed by the city's vast indifference. The Ravencrofts exploited this brutal reality with chilling efficiency. "The unburdened," Thomas noted, "are purest. Their cries are unheard by the worldly, their departure unmourned. They serve the architect with an innocence denied to those steeped in sin." The language was always couched in pseudo-religious terms, a veneer of twisted piety over acts of unimaginable cruelty. It was during this phase that the true scale of their madness became apparent. The purification of these new vessels involved methods far more brutal than self-flagellation. Thomas's entries, while still coded, hinted at prolonged confinement, forced ingestion of unknown substances, and increasingly invasive procedures designed to break the ego and liberate the core essence. It was a horrifying pseudo-scientific spiritualism, a grotesque attempt to force transcendence through systemic torture. Dr. Elias Thorne, a physician with a tarnished reputation who had inexplicably joined the Brethren, played a crucial role here, lending his medical knowledge to the Ravencrofts' dark agenda. His involvement allowed them to push the boundaries of human endurance, transforming their rituals into a horrifying blend of cultic devotion and crude physiological experimentation. The scent of disinfectants mixed with something far fouler in the sealed church, a testament to the horrors unfolding within. The very fabric of their sanity and their humanity was unraveling, all in pursuit of a twisted enlightenment. What secrets, then, did the Ravencrofts believe these broken vessels would reveal? What ultimate truth did they seek to extract from such profound suffering? The next steps, as outlined in the journal, were simply labeled the Confluence. The Confluence, as described by Thomas Ravencroft, was the ultimate aim of their horrifying work. It was a ritual intended to merge the purified consciousness of their unwilling subjects with the collective will of the brethren, creating a single, potent conduit to the architect. This was not just about individual transformation. It was about forging a collective entity, a monstrous new being born of shared suffering and manipulated will. The details, sparse and veiled, suggested a kind of psychic siphon, where the fractured minds of the victims were meant to be absorbed, their raw essence fueling the spiritual ascent of the core members. The methods became even more esoteric and terrifying. Thomas wrote of harmonic resonance, of specific frequencies and tonal chants used to align minds, and of a central focusing chamber within the church, where the final, dreadful merging was to occur. The air in the city remained charged with the distant thunder of the war, a constant, low hum of anxiety that served as a perfect cover for the Ravencroft's atrocities. Few would notice if a few more lost souls simply ceased to exist, their brief, miserable lives ending in anonymity. The city's authorities, overwhelmed by the demands of wartime, had little capacity for investigating missing persons, especially those from the marginalized fringes of society. The Ravencroft brothers, with their respectable public facades and carefully cultivated networks, ensured their activities remained cloaked in secrecy. Their funding, though never explicitly detailed in the journals, appeared substantial, suggesting powerful, unseen benefactors who either shared their twisted vision or simply provided resources in exchange for ideological influence. The true depth of their delusion, or perhaps their malevolence, became apparent in Thomas's final, chilling observation on the Confluence. When the many become one, the architect speaks not in whispers but in thunder, and the world will finally hear its true master. This was not merely about personal enlightenment. It was about ushering in a new age, a new order born from the depths of human pain. But before this horrific culmination could be fully realized, an unexpected intervention was about to shatter their carefully constructed world. A single, desperate act of defiance from within the very heart of their captive vessels would expose a truth too terrible to remain buried. The intervention came not from external forces, but from within the church's grim walls, a desperate act of rebellion against unimaginable cruelty. One of the unburdened vessels, a young woman known only as Elara in Thomas Ravencroft's clinical notes, managed a moment of terrifying clarity amidst the constant torment. Her survival instinct, battered but not broken, allowed her a fleeting opportunity to act. She exploited a moment of laxity, perhaps a consequence of the brethren's own escalating fervor, and managed to ignite a small fire in a storage area adjacent to the main ritual chamber. The fire, though quickly contained, created enough smoke and chaos to draw attention. It was a faint wisp against the New York sky, easily mistaken for a chimney fire or a nearby building blaze in the bustling city. But it was enough. The smoke, thin and acrid, caught the attention of a street urchin named Finn, who often scavenged near the abandoned church. Finn, accustomed to the city's grim realities, knew the building was supposed to be empty. The faint scent of strange incense mixed with the acrid smoke raised his young, streetwise suspicions. He didn't hesitate. He ran to the nearest police precinct, a small, unassuming building often overwhelmed with wartime petty crime. His report, initially dismissed as a child's fantasy, described ghosts and strange smells from the supposedly vacant church. Officer O'Malley, a beat cop weary from long shifts and endless calls, was reluctantly dispatched. What he found when he cautiously approached the blacked-out church was not just smoke, but a low, rhythmic chanting that pulsed through the heavy wooden doors, a sound deeply unsettling and utterly out of place. This wasn't a fire. It was something else entirely. The door, previously sealed, now showed signs of a hurried, incomplete resecuring. O'Malley, a veteran of the city's underbelly, felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the unnatural silence beyond the chants. He called for backup, his voice tight with an unspoken dread. The Ravencroft's carefully constructed world of secrecy was about to be violently torn open, not by grand conspiracy, but by a wisp of smoke and the persistent intuition of a forgotten child. The confrontation, when it came, would be swift and brutal, revealing horrors that even the most hardened city officials were unprepared for. When Officer O'Malley and his backup, a small contingent of equally bewildered policemen, finally breached the reinforced doors of the Ravencroft church, they were met not with resistance, but with a scene of utter, disorienting horror. The air was thick with a cloying, metallic scent that O'Malley would forever associate with fear and decay. The chanting, which had been so pervasive from outside, abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. In the dim, gaslit interior, figures draped in dark robes stood frozen, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fanaticism. The focusing chamber, as Thomas Ravencroft had termed it, was the epicenter of the nightmare. Crude surgical instruments lay scattered next to makeshift altars. Several emaciated individuals, clearly the unburdened vessels, were found restrained, some barely conscious, bearing the horrifying marks of prolonged abuse and experimentation. Their vacant stares and whispered incoherencies spoke volumes without uttering a single coherent word. The Ravencroft brothers, initially calm, quickly descended into a frenzy of religious ecstasy, spouting prophecies of the architect's coming and screaming about the profanity of interruption. Their words, recorded later by a bewildered stenographer, made no sense to the officers, but the sheer, unhinged conviction behind them was chilling. Dr. Thorne, the physician, was found attempting to destroy medical logs, his hands trembling, his face a mask of panicked desperation. The scene was too grotesque, too profoundly disturbing to be easily rationalized. It wasn't just murder. It was something far more ritualistic, more systemic, a calculated act of spiritual terrorism. The police, accustomed to the grittier forms of human depravity, were visibly shaken. This was a new breed of darkness, one that blurred the lines between madness, religion, and outright sadism. The discovery sent shockwaves, not through the public, which remained largely unaware, but through the city's nascent justice system. The immediate question was how to process such an unspeakable crime, how to explain acts that seemed to defy all logic and reason. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the Ravencroft church were a desperate attempt to impose order on an unfathomable chaos. The city's legal minds grappled with a case unlike any they had ever encountered. How does one prosecute spiritual fanaticism that manifests as systematic torture and disappearance? The brothers, Thomas and Arthur Ravencroft, along with Dr. Elias Thorne, were quickly arrested. Their remaining followers, a dazed and emaciated group, were taken into custody, many requiring immediate medical and psychiatric care. The grand jury, convened in a stifling New York courtroom, heard testimony that pushed the boundaries of credulity. Officers described the horrifying scene, medical examiners detailed the unspeakable condition of the victims, and the few coherent survivors offered fragmented, terrifying accounts of cleansing and confluence. Thomas Ravencroft, remarkably, remained articulate and defiant throughout, presenting himself not as a criminal but as a misunderstood prophet. He lectured the court on ancient rituals, on the necessity of suffering for enlightenment, and on the existence of the architect, a cosmic entity he claimed to be serving. He even quoted excerpts from his own meticulously kept journal, inadvertently providing damning evidence against himself. Arthur Ravencroft, the elder brother, was more withdrawn, his eyes often fixed on some distant, unseen point, occasionally erupting into sudden, guttural incantations in an unknown tongue. Dr. Thorne, on the other hand, broke down quickly, confessing his complicity under the weight of his own conscience, but his explanations of psychic energy and transdimensional communication only further muddied the waters. The press, initially keen on the sensational story, found it too bizarre, too unsettling to fully report. Editorials struggled to find a coherent narrative. The war still dominated headlines, and the public seemed to have little appetite for a tale of such grotesque, incomprehensible depravity. The official reports were heavily sanitized, focusing on murder and assault, carefully omitting the more esoteric, cultic elements. The city, it seemed, preferred a simpler, more digestible horror. Yet despite the efforts to downplay the strangeness, the lingering question remained. How deep did this web of darkness truly extend, and were the Ravencrofts merely pawns in a larger, unseen game? The trial of the Ravencroft brothers and Dr. Thorne became a closed-door affair, deemed too disturbing for public consumption, and too potentially disruptive to a society already fracturing under the strain of war. The decision was made by a coalition of city officials and powerful, unnamed figures who feared the psychological impact of such a narrative. The official reason cited was the protection of public morality and the prevention of widespread panic, but the underlying truth was a profound unease with the nature of the Ravencrofts' beliefs. The very idea that such systematic, ritualistic horror could occur undetected in the heart of the city challenged deeply held notions of order and safety. The verdict was swift: guilty on multiple counts of murder, assault, and abduction. Dr. Thorne, due to his cooperation and obvious mental breakdown, received a lesser sentence, confined to a state asylum where he would spend his remaining days scribbling incomprehensible equations and muttering about sacred geometry. The Ravencroft brothers, unrepentant to the last, were sentenced to life imprisonment. They died within years of each other, one succumbing to pneumonia, the other to a mysterious fever that swept through the prison wards. Their deaths, like their lives, were shrouded in an unsettling quiet. The church itself was immediately condemned, its interior stripped, its symbols whitewashed and eventually razed to the ground. A small park was later built over the site, an attempt to erase the memory, to plant something innocent over the blood-soaked earth. But erasure is rarely complete. Whispers persisted among the police who first entered the church, among the handful of journalists who saw the initial reports, and especially among the families of the unburdened vessels, who never received proper closure. The most chilling aspect was the discovery of Thomas Ravencroft's complete journal. Deemed too inflammatory for the trial, it was sealed away in a municipal archive, marked restricted access, national security implications. It was a designation that baffled many, for what threat could the ramblings of a madman pose to national security? Unless, of course, those ramblings contained a kernel of truth about forces far older and more pervasive than mere individual madness. The sealing of Thomas Ravencroft's journal was a crucial act, not just of suppression, but of active historical revision. The designation national security implications was a bureaucratic maneuver, a silent signal that the true danger wasn't merely the brothers' actions, but the ideas they espoused. The city's elite understood that the public's faith in institutions, already fragile during wartime, could not withstand the revelation that a sophisticated, ritualistic cult had operated with such impunity. The official narrative quickly settled. The Ravencrofts were isolated madmen, their followers deluded victims. The uncomfortable questions about their funding, their influence, and the sheer audacity of their operations were swept under the rug. The press, guided by subtle pressures and its own desire for less disturbing stories, complied. New York moved on, desperate to forget the dark stain on its burgeoning reputation. Yet the journal, locked away in its secure vault, remained a potent, silent witness. It contained not only the chilling details of the rituals, but also lengthy, pseudo-scholarly treatises on ancient esoteric practices, connections drawn between the Ravencroft symbols and other hidden societies stretching back centuries. Thomas Ravencroft believed he was merely rediscovering an ancient current, a true current of power that manipulated human civilization from the shadows. His writings referenced obscure alchemical texts, Gnostic fragments, and even pre-Columbian motifs, all interwoven with his own twisted interpretations. The implications were staggering. If his theories held even a sliver of truth, the Ravencroft rituals were not an isolated incident of madness, but a manifestation of a much older, deeper network of control. This was why the journal was deemed a national security threat. It wasn't because it contained state secrets, but because it threatened to unravel the very fabric of accepted history, to expose the unseen architecture of power. The very idea that such ancient, dark forces could still be at play in modern America, influencing events from beneath the surface, was deemed too dangerous for the public mind. It was a narrative too unsettling, too corrosive to public trust. The sealed document became a testament to the fact that some truths are not merely forgotten, but actively buried, their potential to awaken a deeper, more profound form of fear deemed too great a risk. The park built over the former site of the Ravencroft Church, initially intended as a balm, became instead a silent monument to the city's willful amnesia. Locals, particularly those of older generations, developed an unspoken aversion to it. Children played there, but their laughter sometimes seemed thin, easily swallowed by the wind. Dogs barked with an unusual intensity near the patch of ground where the focusing chamber once stood. It became a place where people didn't linger after dusk, a site imbued with an unspoken, residual dread. The memory of what happened there, though officially erased, clung to the very soil. This phenomenon, this collective subconscious unease, is a recurring theme in the history of dark rituals and suppressed horrors. The land remembers, even if the people choose to forget. The energy of profound suffering, of violent manipulation, leaves an indelible mark. It's not a ghost in the conventional sense, but a psychic residue, a vibration that subtly shifts the atmosphere, a low hum of discomfort that affects those sensitive enough to perceive it. For decades, the Ravencroft case remained a footnote in obscure police archives, a morbid tale whispered by a few old-timers but never fully investigated or understood. The official narrative held firm, isolated madness, a contained incident. But containment, as history often proves, is an illusion. Ideas, particularly dark ones, have a way of seeping through the cracks, of finding new conduits, new vessels. The Ravencrofts' architect, their true current, were not so easily dismissed by simple incarceration or the demolition of a building. Their philosophy, their symbols, their perverted vision of enlightenment had been committed to paper. And even if that paper was locked away, the concept itself had been unleashed. The very act of sealing the journal acknowledged its potential power, its capacity to ignite similar obsessions in minds receptive to such darkness. The silence of the park, therefore, was not merely the peace of nature, but the heavy, deliberate silence of a history actively suppressed, a lie maintained. And beneath that silence, something still stirred, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to disturb the carefully constructed peace and unearth what was never meant to be remembered. Decades later, in the late 1960s, a young, ambitious archivist named Dr. Aris Thorne, a distant relative of the disgraced Dr. Elias Thorne, though he was entirely unaware of the connection, stumbled upon the sealed Ravencroft journal during a routine inventory of restricted documents in a New York municipal archive. The national security implications tag, typically reserved for Cold War intelligence or classified military operations, immediately piqued his academic curiosity. This wasn't a standard historical record. It was an anomaly, a forgotten artifact of an almost forgotten crime. He requested access, initially denied, then granted after he leveraged his family's minor but long-standing political connections, a twist of fate that would prove tragically ironic. As Aris delved into the journal, he wasn't looking for sensationalism. He was a scholar, driven by the desire to understand the hidden currents of history. But what he found was far more than a macabre curiosity. Thomas Ravencroft's meticulous hand, his chillingly lucid prose, and the intricate diagrams of symbols and rituals began to exert a subtle, insidious pull. Aris, initially approaching it with a detached academic skepticism, found himself increasingly disturbed, then utterly captivated. He saw not just madness, but a perverse logic, a terrifyingly consistent worldview that linked ancient Gnostic beliefs with a radical interpretation of human suffering. He spent months poring over the document, cross-referencing Ravencroft's obscure references, tracing the lineage of the symbols. He discovered that the interlocking circles and the single eye appeared in contexts far removed from 19th century New York, in places ranging from medieval alchemical texts to isolated tribal art from the American Southwest. The symbols, Ravencroft had claimed, were the original language of the architect, a universal key to unlocking a hidden reality. Aris, initially convinced Ravencroft was merely appropriating existing symbols to bolster his delusions, began to feel an unsettling shift in his perspective. Could there be a deeper, unseen pattern at play? Was Ravencroft merely insane, or had he genuinely tapped into something ancient and profoundly disturbing? The journal's power lay not in its explicit horrors, but in its ability to slowly, subtly, unravel the reader's own assumptions about reality. Aris Thorne was about to learn just how potent a weapon a buried idea could be. The journal was beginning to reawaken, and with it, the echo of the Ravencroft rituals. Aris Thorne's growing obsession with the Ravencroft journal began to isolate him. His colleagues, initially intrigued by his obscure research, grew increasingly wary as his explanations became more fervent, his theories more outlandish. He spoke of encoded history, of subterranean currents of control, and of symbols that acted as psychic commands. These were not the measured tones of a scholar, but the impassioned pronouncements of a man teetering on the edge of a dangerous revelation. He started seeing the interlocking circles and the single eye symbol everywhere, subtly integrated into corporate logos, etched into the architecture of old buildings, even hidden in the intricate designs of federal seals. Where before he saw coincidence, he now saw design, a pervasive, silent language woven into the fabric of the modern world. He became convinced that Thomas Ravencroft, despite his horrific acts, had genuinely stumbled upon a truth about a hidden priesthood, an ancient order that manipulated human belief and perception. The architect, in Aris's evolving interpretation, wasn't necessarily a divine being, but a systemic intelligence, a force that had been shaping human civilization for millennia, using suffering and control as its primary tools. He documented his own findings in a series of frantic, handwritten notes, mirroring the very intensity of Thomas Ravencroft's original journal. His wife, worried by his increasingly erratic behavior and his withdrawal from family life, urged him to seek help, to abandon the dark research that was consuming him. But Aris, like Thomas before him, felt he was on the cusp of an unparalleled discovery, a key to unlocking the true history of power. He believed he was immune to the journal's insidious influence, that his academic rigor would protect him. He was wrong. The journal was not merely a record, it was a blueprint, a methodology for awakening something ancient and terrible. And Aris, in his intellectual hubris, was unknowingly following its instructions, step by chilling step, toward his own personal confluence. The parallels between his descent and that of the Brethren were becoming terrifyingly clear, blurring the lines between researcher and subject. Aris Thorne's research culminated in a manuscript he titled The Architecture of Amnesia, a sprawling, dense work that meticulously connected the Ravencroft symbols and philosophy to a vast, unseen network of historical manipulation. He theorized that major societal shifts, from the rise of empires to the framing of religious dogma, were not organic developments, but carefully orchestrated events by this hidden priesthood, using symbols and manufactured narratives to control collective consciousness. His manuscript became a dangerous echo of Thomas Ravencroft's own fevered pronouncements. He argued that modern institutions, government, education, media, were merely updated masks for this ancient system, designed to keep humanity in a state of controlled ignorance, forever seeking salvation from external sources while the true masters harvested their collective energy and obedience. The scarcity principle, the idea that there's never enough, was, according to Aris, a deliberate doctrine engineered to foster competition and prevent unity. He believed the Ravencroft rituals in their extreme form were a crude but potent attempt to accelerate this process, to force a direct connection with the architect by bypassing the slow, systemic methods. They don't want you to see the bars of the cage, he wrote, because then you try to escape. They make you believe the cage is freedom, that its boundaries are protection. His once respected academic reputation evaporated. He was dismissed from his position, his theories ridiculed as paranoia, his name tarnished. But Aris, by then, no longer cared for academic validation. He felt he was seeing the world with terrifying clarity for the first time, a world where truth was not discovered, but instructed. His last known act was to attempt to publish his manuscript independently, seeking to expose the architecture of amnesia to the world. He sent copies to various fringe presses and underground publications, convinced that once enough people saw the patterns, the entire edifice of control would crumble. The final chapter of his manuscript ended with a chilling, almost desperate plea. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a process of waking up, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and they will never let you go back to sleep. It was a declaration of war against an invisible enemy, a cry into the void that threatened to unleash something far more unsettling than mere historical revision. Before Aris Thorne's architecture of amnesia could be widely circulated, it vanished. Not physically destroyed, but subtly, effectively suppressed. The few fringe presses he contacted found their distribution channels mysteriously blocked, their funding opportunities drying up. The manuscript itself was dismissed by critics as the ramblings of a deluded academic, a sensationalist work devoid of any credible evidence. His name, already associated with madness, served as a convenient deterrent. It was a textbook example of the gatekeepers at work, as Aris himself had described them, not with overt censorship, but with a smothering wave of silence and ridicule. The tactics were subtle but devastatingly effective. Discredit the messenger, bury the message in noise, make the truth seem utterly absurd. This wasn't violence, it was psychological warfare. Aris Thorne himself disappeared shortly after. No foul play was ever officially reported. His wife received a cryptic, unsigned letter stating he had gone to find deeper truths, a phrase that chilled her to the bone. Police investigations yielded no answers, and eventually, Aris Thorne, like the victims of the Ravencroft rituals, simply faded from public record, another ghost in the city's vast, indifferent memory. His manuscript, however, did not entirely disappear. A single, incomplete copy found its way to a young, independent journalist named Sarah Jenkins in the early 1990s. Sarah was known for her tenacious pursuit of suppressed stories, her refusal to accept official narratives. She stumbled upon Aris's work while researching a broader piece on historical anomalies and cult phenomena. The moment she read the opening lines, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The interlocking circles, the single eye, the true current. These symbols and concepts resonated with other unsettling patterns she had observed in her own investigations. She immediately recognized the profound, almost dangerous significance of Aris's theories, but she also understood the immense risk. Aris Thorne's disappearance, the subtle suppression of his work, served as a potent warning. Sarah knew she was treading on dangerous ground, disturbing a silence that powerful forces had painstakingly maintained for over a century. The manuscript wasn't just a document, it was a live wire, capable of reawakening a buried darkness. Sarah Jenkins approached Aris Thorne's manuscript with a blend of journalistic skepticism and an undeniable, growing sense of unease. Unlike Aris, she was hyper-aware of the dangers of obsession, understanding that the very act of seeking forbidden knowledge could become a trap. She began her own parallel investigation, cautiously cross-referencing Aris's claims with independent historical records, declassified documents, and overlooked archives. What she found was a disconcerting pattern of erasure and deliberate misdirection. Records of disappearances in 19th-century New York that were never fully explained, subtle edits in official accounts of the Ravencroft case, and recurring symbols in unexpected places. She discovered that the park built over the Ravencroft church site had, at various points, been subjected to strange, unpublicized geological surveys, the results of which were always inconclusive or lost. The silence surrounding the original case was not natural. It was engineered, maintained by powerful, unseen hands. Sarah also investigated the claims of the architect and the true current, delving into esoteric literature, ancient mythologies, and the history of secret societies. She found that while Ravencroft's interpretations were extreme, the underlying concepts of hidden knowledge, of a controlling intelligence operating behind the scenes of history, were remarkably persistent across cultures and millennia. The true genius of the priesthood, she realized, was not to invent these concepts, but to weaponize them, to twist genuine spiritual yearning into a tool of control. The greatest trick, she wrote in her own preliminary notes, is not to hide the truth, but to make it appear ridiculous, dangerous, or merely the delusion of madmen. She began to understand why Aris Thorn had been so effectively silenced. His architecture of amnesia wasn't merely a theory. It was a direct threat to the very foundation of this hidden power structure. Sarah knew that if she were to continue, she couldn't just present the facts. She had to weave a narrative, a story that would bypass the gatekeepers and awaken a curiosity strong enough to withstand ridicule. She was preparing to re-enter a long-forgotten battle, armed with only a fragmented manuscript and her own unyielding resolve. The silence, she understood, was not empty. It was a warning. Sarah Jenkins' investigation led her down increasingly darker paths, revealing not just suppression, but active manipulation of historical memory. She found evidence of whisper campaigns against anyone who dared to question official narratives, subtle psychological operations designed to discredit and isolate those who sought deeper truths. She even encountered chilling parallels to the conditioning techniques described in Thomas Ravencroft's journal, albeit in a far more sophisticated societal form. Modern media, education, and even popular culture, she began to realize, were subtly teaching people what to fear, what to believe, and what to forget, just as the Ravencrofts had done with their cult. The goal was always the same: to manage perception, to control reality. One of Sarah's most disturbing discoveries came from an obscure academic paper she unearthed, detailing the psychological impact of repeated exposure to paradox. The paper argued that when individuals are consistently presented with contradictory truths, e.g., freedom is your birthright, but obedience is your duty, the mind compartmentalizes, creating internal fractures that make individuals more susceptible to external control. This was Aris Thorn's Codex of Contradiction, the very programming he believed the hidden priesthood had engineered into society for centuries. Sarah recognized it immediately as the insidious mechanism behind the Ravencrofts' cleansing of the vessel. They had used extreme physical contradictions to shatter their victims' minds, making them pliable for the Confluence. The broader society, she reasoned, was subjected to a more subtle, slower version of the same process. It was a deeply unsettling revelation, painting a picture of humanity as a vast, unwitting experiment, continually subjected to a silent, systemic conditioning. The deeper she dug, the more she understood that the Ravencroft rituals were not merely a historical oddity, but a violent, hyper-accelerated manifestation of a pervasive, ancient system of control. The brothers were not truly exceptional in their methods, only in their terrifying bluntness. Their very existence was proof that the architecture of amnesia was horrifyingly real. But how, Sarah wondered, could one even begin to dismantle such an ancient, deeply embedded system without falling victim to its pervasive influence? Sarah Jenkins knew that merely presenting the raw facts of the Ravencroft rituals or Aris Thorn's theories would be insufficient. The gatekeepers would simply label it as another conspiracy theory, another fringe obsession. She understood the power of narrative, of crafting a story that could bypass the mind's defenses and speak directly to a deeper, intuitive understanding. She decided to present her findings not as an academic paper, but as a long-form documentary script, designed for maximum immersion and retention. She would embody the role of the third-person investigator, a research journalist uncovering forbidden truths, much like the persona she was now living. Her goal was to guide her audience through the layers of amnesia, to show them the architecture of control, without explicitly telling them what to believe. She would use the Ravencroft rituals as the anchor, the chilling historical anomaly that served as a microcosm for the larger, unseen patterns of manipulation. She would weave historical context with sensory details, drawing the audience into the oppressive atmosphere of 1862 New York, making them feel the fear, the confusion, and the manufactured hope that allowed such horrors to flourish. She would leverage Aris Thorne's keys, the concepts of embedded symbols, manufactured scarcity, and the codex of contradiction, to slowly unlock the audience's own perceptions. Her script would be a descent, mirroring the Ravencroft's own twisted journey, but instead of leading to enslavement, it would lead to awareness. She meticulously planned out the structure, envisioning the ominous tone, the suspenseful packing, and the slow, deliberate unveiling of interconnected truths. She knew the risks were immense. She was now actively challenging the very system Aris Thorne had warned about, exposing its methods and numbing its silent operations. The act of creating this script was, in itself, an act of rebellion, a direct confrontation with the curators of forgetting. She began to write, her fingers flying across the keyboard, driven by a profound sense of urgency. The silence, she understood, was not just a historical vacuum. It was a weapon, and she intended to shatter it with sound, with truth, with memory. As Sarah Jenkins began to write, she started to notice the omnipresent, almost hypnotic influence of the hymn of the hollow crowns. This was Aris Thorne's term for the pervasive, unacknowledged anthem of control, a subtle sonic and symbolic language woven into popular culture. It wasn't just music. It was the rhythm of advertisements, the cadence of political speeches, the visual branding of global corporations. She recognized the interlocking circles, the single eye, and other recurring motifs appearing in unexpected places, not as overt symbols, but as subliminal cues, conditioning the collective subconscious. The hymn, she realized, played constantly in the background of modern life, shaping desires, anxieties, and beliefs without conscious detection. It was the ultimate form of societal conditioning, an evolution of the Ravencroft's tonal chants and symbolic alignments, but amplified to a global scale. She saw how this hymn generated a manufactured consent, making people believe they were making free choices when in reality their preferences had been meticulously curated. This awareness sharpened her resolve to craft her script, not just as a story, but as a counter-hymn, a different frequency designed to break through the programming. She meticulously selected her words, carefully constructed her phrases, ensuring that each sentence carried weight, each revelation resonated deeply. She infused her narrative with sensory details, describing the heavy gaslight of 1862, the stench of fear in the church, the chilling precision of Thomas Ravencroft's hand. She aimed to create an immersive experience, a journey into the dark underbelly of history that would leave the audience questioning everything they thought they knew. This was more than a documentary. It was an awakening, an invitation to perceive the hidden architecture of control that operated just beneath the surface of everyday life. Her every word was a challenge to the silence, a defiance against the forgotten history, a beacon against the pervasive darkness. But the deeper she delved, the more she felt the weight of the watchers, the unseen guardians of the established narrative, their silent, invisible presence growing stronger, more attentive. The watchers, as Aris Thorne had termed them, were a constant, unseen pressure on Sarah Jenkins as she continued her work. These were not individuals, but rather an omnipresent system of observation and subtle calibration, designed to detect and neutralize threats to the established narrative. Her online activity, her research inquiries, her communications, all were subject to a quiet scrutiny. She noticed unusual glitches in her computer, strange delays in email, and a disquieting sense of being monitored. It was never overt, never threatening, but always subtly present, a chilling reminder that her pursuit of forbidden knowledge was not going unnoticed. She understood that the Watcher's greatest fear was vision, someone who could clearly see the blueprint behind the facade, connect the scattered dots, and articulate the hidden architecture of control. They didn't need to physically harm her. They simply needed to make her work disappear, to render her efforts irrelevant, to brand her as just another conspiracy theorist. The strategy was to isolate her, discredit her, and ultimately to make her silence herself. Yet this pressure only fueled Sarah's resolve. She wove the concept of the Watchers directly into her script, illustrating how this pervasive surveillance operated not through overt force, but through subtle psychological and informational manipulation. She warned her audience that their own perceptions were being shaped, their fears exploited, their curiosity subtly redirected. Her script became a meta-narrative, exposing not just the Ravencroft rituals, but the very mechanisms by which such horrors were buried and forgotten. She sought to turn the tables, to make the audience themselves the Watchers, capable of discerning the hidden patterns of control. As she meticulously crafted each section, ensuring every word resonated with ominous truth, she felt an almost sacred duty to Eris Thorne, to the victims of the Ravencroft rituals, and to all who had been silenced by the architecture of amnesia. Her mission was clear: to break the spell of manufactured silence, to reawaken the collective memory, and to ensure that the secrets buried for over a century would finally see the light. The deeper she went, the more the words flowed, an unstoppable tide of unearthing. Sarah Jenkins found herself in a race against time, not just to complete her script, but to release it before the Watchers could fully move against her. The subtle interference escalated. Key research documents would mysteriously disappear from her files, digital backups would become corrupted, and her communication channels would experience unexplained disruptions. It was a sophisticated, invisible war being waged against her and her burgeoning truth. Yet the more resistance she encountered, the more convinced she became of the profound importance of her work. The very act of suppression affirmed the power of the Ravencroft Journal and Eris Thorne's analysis. The system, she realized, was reacting to her proximity to a forbidden truth. She delved into the final, most disturbing implications of the Ravencroft rituals, the idea of redemption by ruin, where suffering was not merely tolerated, but actively induced as a pathway to control. She connected this to broader societal narratives that glorified martyrdom, that preached obedience through pain, and that offered salvation only after individuals had been thoroughly broken and remade in the image of the system. This was the core deception, convincing people they were inherently flawed, that their natural instincts were sinful, and that only through external authority could they achieve wholeness. It was a spiritual and psychological enslavement, designed to foster perpetual dependency. Her script laid bare this insidious mechanism, showing how institutions, from churches to governments, had historically leveraged this redemption by ruin to maintain power. The Ravencrofts had simply taken this societal principle to its most literal and brutal extreme within the confines of their sealed church. Sarah's writing was no longer just an investigation. It was a desperate plea for self-reclamation. She urged her audience to question the sources of their guilt, their shame, and their manufactured sense of brokenness. The silence she sought to shatter was not just external, but internal, the silence of self-doubt and unaddressed trauma that prevented individuals from recognizing their inherent worth and power. She understood that the battle was not just for historical truth, but for the very soul of human perception. The finish line was in sight, but the resistance grew fiercer with every word. The climax of Sarah Jenkins' script revolved around the concept of the illusion of choice, an idea Eris Thorne had explored in depth, drawing parallels to the subtle manipulations employed by the Ravencroft brothers. She argued that society, much like the cult, presented individuals with a limited menu of pre-approved options: political parties, consumer brands, ideological frameworks, and then called it freedom. This carefully curated selection gave the illusion of autonomy, while ensuring that all paths ultimately led back to the same central system of control. "You are offered a vote," she wrote, "but never the power to rewrite the ballot. You can protest, but only within the boundaries of the cage they built." It was a profound insight into the mechanisms of manufactured consent, where active participation in one's own subtle enslavement was achieved through the clever manipulation of perceived alternatives. The Ravencrofts had used this with their willing followers, offering them a choice between mundane suffering and spiritual enlightenment through radical pain, when in reality, both paths led to their ultimate control. Sarah's script meticulously deconstructed this illusion, urging her audience to look beyond the presented options, to question the very framework of choice itself. She implored them to recognize that true rebellion wasn't louder applause for a rigged system, but a defiant silence, a refusal to perform, a walkout from a play they never asked to be in. "The show," she articulated with chilling clarity, "only continues as long as you keep clapping." This was the ultimate empowerment she sought to instill, the recognition that the power of the system rested on the individual's participation and consent, however manufactured. It was a dangerous message, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of societal order. As she finalized these crucial sections, the pressure from the watchers became almost unbearable. Her computer screens would flicker, strange pop-up messages would appear and vanish, and the feeling of unseen eyes intensified. She knew she was nearing a critical threshold, that the release of this script would be an act of profound, irreversible defiance. In the final stages of her writing, Sarah Jenkins grappled with the profound question of identity, the ultimate battleground in the war for perception. She delved into Thomas Ravencroft's chilling methods of unmaking the self, where the individual identities of the vessels were systematically stripped away, replaced by the collective consciousness of the brethren. She connected this to the broader societal practice of labeling, where individuals are reduced to names, numbers, occupations, and expectations, their inherent worth defined by external metrics rather than internal truth. "They don't want you to see yourself, truly see," she wrote, "because the moment you look past the distortion, past the guilt, the shame, the programming, they lose their grip." The mirror, in her metaphor, became the most dangerous artifact in any control system, revealing what one was before the molding and what one could become without the external definitions. Her script became a powerful call to self-reclamation, an urgent plea for individuals to wipe clean the fogged mirrors of their minds and remember who they were before the programming. She challenged the audience to question every label, every predefined role, every external validation. This was the deepest layer of the architecture of amnesia, the systematic erasure of the authentic self, replaced by a compliant, easily managed identity. The Ravencrofts had sought to control their victims by destroying their sense of self. The modern system, Sarah argued, achieved the same goal through more subtle psychological means, constantly whispering, "Don't look too closely. Don't ask who you really are. Don't remember." But her script aimed to break that spell. She envisioned her work not just as a historical exposé, but as a catalyst for personal awakening, a prompt for deep introspection. She was meticulously weaving a narrative that would not only inform but transform, empowering individuals to reclaim their authentic selves from the shadows of manufactured identity. The final words of this section formed a potent challenge. "You are not a label. You are not a function. You are the storm that breaks the frame." The covenant of the unseen, as Eris Thorne had termed it, became a central theme in Sarah Jenkins' penultimate sections. This was the unwritten agreement, the silent pact between rulers and shadows, where true power resided not in law or public doctrine, but in secrecy, in decisions made without minutes, in alliances sealed with silence. She detailed how the Ravencrofts operated within this covenant, their activities shielded not just by their respectable facades, but by a network of unspoken protections, their crimes overlooked by a system designed to maintain appearances. Sarah argued that this covenant was still very much alive, thriving in the modern world through red tape, redacted documents, and the deliberate obfuscation of truth. Fairness is the mask power wears to keep you docile, she asserted, exposing how society was fed just enough scandal, just enough outrage to keep attention diverted, never enough clarity to spark genuine rebellion. The audience, she claimed, was meant to suspect but never truly see, to question but never fully know. But the cracks, she insisted, were growing. Whistleblowers, leaks, unearthed documents. These were the fissures appearing in the covenant, threatening to reveal the hands behind the curtain. Her script urged viewers to notice the patterns, the coincidences that aren't, the manufactured enemies, the curated heroes. She wanted them to stop playing their assigned roles, to realize that once they saw the hand behind the curtain, they couldn't unsee it. This section was a direct challenge to apathy, an invitation to active observation and critical thought. The legacy of the Ravencroft rituals, she posited, was not just a forgotten horror, but a chilling blueprint for this covenant of the unseen, a testament to how easily profound atrocities could be shielded by a carefully maintained silence. As she moved towards the climax, the weight of exposing such a pervasive system pressed down on her, an almost physical presence in her solitude. The pervasive affection as control was a concept Sarah Jenkins meticulously unpacked in her script, drawing a direct line from the subtle manipulation within families and communities to the cultic control of the Ravencrofts. She argued that the most dangerous form of control wasn't force, but tenderness, a soothing lullaby that lulled individuals into submission, flattering their loyalty while subtly sealing their cage. They told you they loved you and you believed it, she wrote, describing how institutions, nations, and even religions sang songs of belonging and purpose, while simultaneously studying, testing, and shaping desires so that chains would feel earned. She posited that what was presented as culture, tradition, or patriotism was in reality a sophisticated system for cultivating loyalty, a golden leash masquerading as gratitude. The Ravencrofts, she revealed, had mastered this in their dark church, offering a warped form of love and belonging to their disillusioned followers while demanding absolute obedience and self-sacrifice. When their victims began to awaken, the brothers didn't rage. They mourned, uttering phrases like, "We only wanted what's best for you," thus weaponizing emotional attachment. Sarah's script cut through this deceptive tenderness, asserting that true love liberates, it doesn't indoctrinate. It doesn't demand silence, nor does it hide behind walls and robes and flags. This was a call to emotional and psychological sovereignty, an urge to question any affection that came with conditions, any love that demanded the suppression of one's truth. It was a profound and unsettling revelation, forcing the audience to re-examine their most cherished beliefs and allegiances. The very fabric of their emotional landscape, she suggested, might be intricately woven into the architecture of control. The words poured out of her, an urgent, almost desperate attempt to break these invisible bonds. Sarah Jenkins then turned to the most elegant and insidious tool of control, language itself. She argued that words were not merely tools for communication but invisible shackles, subtly designed to soothe while they trapped. You weren't indoctrinated, she wrote. You were educated. You weren't obedient, you were well-behaved. You weren't silenced, you were polite. This was the essence of the spell, the slow erosion of rebellion, masked as good manners, appropriate decorum, or societal harmony. She connected this directly to the Ravencrofts' deliberate manipulation of spiritual language, using terms like cleansing, vessel, and confluence to normalize horrifying acts. Their lexicon transformed unspeakable cruelty into a sacred journey. Sarah's script illustrated how language trained individuals not to roar, to bite their tongues, and thus tighten their own collars. Society, much like the cult, constantly whispered, "Don't be emotional, don't be radical, don't make waves." But the truth, she insisted, was that language was the first weapon of control, and silence its ultimate victory. Her script became a guide for breaking this linguistic spell, for speaking truth, for breaking the rhythm, for naming the lie for what it truly was. She challenged the audience to understand that when they spoke forbidden truths, they were not just breaking rules, but dismantling powerful, ancient enchantments. The 23rd key, she declared, vibrated in the throat, and it was time to stop speaking in their tongue. This was an invitation to linguistic liberation, to reclaim the power of one's own voice, to use words not to conform but to awaken. The profound implications of this idea, that entire systems of belief were constructed and maintained by the careful curation of language, were deeply unsettling, revealing yet another layer of the architecture of amnesia. The next revelation in Sarah Jenkins' script was perhaps the most contemporary and chilling: the prison of data, where the new warden was the algorithm. She argued that the Ravencrofts' meticulous journals, their detailed records of psychological manipulation, were a crude precursor to the modern surveillance state. Now, she explained, the prison had no bars, the jailer no badge, but data, raw, infinite, invisible, became the chains. The algorithm, she asserted, didn't blink or sleep. It learned, watched through screens, mapped fears, cataloged wants, and then fed each individual the exact illusion they would cling to, the precise belief they would defend. "It doesn't need you awake," she wrote with stark clarity. "It just needs you predictable." This was the digital evolution of the hymn of the hollow crowns, a silent, always-on form of control that promised comfort and personalization while subtly sealing the cage. The shadow, she articulated, was cast not by overt force, but by convenience, by the pervasive lie that you are free, you chose this is tailored for you. But the tailoring, she reminded her audience, was done by unseen hands, the same lineage of architects who had once instructed emperors and guided cult leaders. The algorithm, she warned, was not evil in itself, but it was obedient, a tool serving those who still equated control with godliness. Her script became a desperate plea to recognize this digital cage, to understand that the door was never locked, that the freedom to walk away was always there, though obscured by constant engagement. The blue glow of screens, she suggested, had replaced the flickering gaslight of the Ravencroft church, but the purpose remained the same: to manage perception, to control reality. This was the most urgent call to awareness, a demand to look up from the screen and see the world beyond the curated illusion. Sarah then introduced the chilling concept of the Book of Forgotten Names, a ledger not kept by governments, but by the very forces that sought to erase truth. These were the names of whistleblowers, truth-tellers, pattern disruptors, not all killed, but most discredited, unmade, their existence scrubbed from collective memory. She drew a direct parallel to the unburdened vessels of the Ravencroft rituals, whose lives were deemed inconsequential and whose disappearances went unmourned. "You'd think they'd be martyrs," she wrote, "but a martyr is remembered. These ones vanish." This book, she explained, wasn't stored in a vault but encoded across platforms, fragmented, encrypted, an algorithmic ooze. You might pass one on the street, she suggested, their eyes still holding the fire, but their name would yield nothing online, nothing in official records, nothing even in memory. That, she insisted, was the point: not to destroy them, but to unmake them, to ensure their truth never took root. She recounted how Thomas Ravencroft's victims were not just abused, but psychologically erased, their identities absorbed into the cult's collective madness. The modern iteration, she posited, was far more subtle but equally effective. Sarah urged her audience to pay attention to that tug in their chest when something felt wrong, when a truth felt half-formed, when their memory insisted someone was here. She declared that by simply saying these forgotten names, by even trying to remember, one could reclaim a piece of them from the abyss. The book was not closed, she asserted, only hidden, waiting for readers brave enough to remember. This section became a profound act of remembrance itself, a defiance of the curators of forgetting, a call to honor those who had paid the ultimate price for seeing too much. It was a potent challenge to the collective amnesia, a demand to re-engage with the hidden narratives and acknowledge the existence of those who had been systematically silenced. Sarah Jenkins then peeled back another layer of the architecture of amnesia with the concept of the ghost script. This was the unwritten law, she explained, buried beneath public doctrines and policies, passed down through generations in whispers, not ink. It was the ritual no one admitted to, yet everyone enforced. She argued that this ghost script explained why apologies came too late, why investigations ended too soon, why the wrong people rose and the righteous disappeared. It was the force behind just following orders, the echo behind, that's just how it's done. The Ravencrofts, she revealed, had operated with their own ghost script, an unspoken understanding among the inner circle of the Brethren that dictated which sins to ignore, which rules to bend, and which boundaries to cross in the pursuit of their twisted enlightenment. This script, she insisted, wasn't evil in a cartoonish sense. It was pragmatic, cold, elegant, and ruthlessly efficient, designed to protect the system, not the people. You don't see it, she warned, until it's too late, until the cameras are off, until the laws are bent. But once recognized, she promised, it would be seen everywhere, in every delay, every backroom handshake, every smiling lie. Her script became a teleprompter of truth, forcing the audience to confront the unwritten rules that governed their reality. She challenged them directly. Would they continue reading what they wrote for them, or would they break the script and write their own? This was a call to active discernment, to pierce through the veil of official narratives and perceive the true, unspoken rules of engagement. The ghost script, she demonstrated, was a powerful, invisible hand shaping events, and only by recognizing its existence could one begin to defy its silent commands. The sacred silence, as Sarah Jenkins termed it, was the most profound and terrifying aspect of the architecture of amnesia. This wasn't merely the absence of sound, but a powerful, enforced hush, a collective agreement never to ask certain questions, never to name what was seen, never to disturb the peace that was never meant for individuals but for the system itself. She revealed how this silence was passed down through generations, from fathers who bit their tongues, from mothers who swallowed rage, from ancestors who learned that survival meant staying small. They call it humility, she wrote. They call it grace. But it is erasure, a legacy of shrinking, of knowing better than to disturb the peace that was never meant for you. The Ravencrofts had cultivated this sacred silence within the Brethren, demanding absolute secrecy and unquestioning obedience, ensuring that no doubts or criticisms could challenge their authority. Sarah argued that this was the cost of compliance. A lineage of ghosts haunting hallways with unscreamed truths, pressing their palms against the glass of memory, begging for their stories to be told. But she also offered hope, asserting that individuals could choose sound over silence, truth over tradition, voice over vanishing. It would not be easy, she acknowledged. They would be called ungrateful, disrespectful, dangerous. Let them, she urged, because every time you speak a forbidden truth, you heal 7 generations behind you and 7 ahead. Her script became a defiant breaking of this pact, an unsealing of the covenant of silence. It was a call to reclaim ancestral voices, to speak what was silenced, what was feared, what was whispered only in dreams. The silence, she insisted, was not empty. It was engineered, a potent weapon against collective awakening, and it was time to shatter it. Sarah then delved into the chilling reality that history is not just written by the victors, but actively unwritten by the curators of forgetting. She argued that the Ravencroft rituals, officially reduced to an isolated incident of madness, were a prime example of this deliberate amnesia. These curators, she explained, were not historians, but quiet engineers who shaped timelines like wet clay, removing the inconvenient, polishing the brutal, and romanticizing the oppressive. A massacre becomes a conflict, a rebellion becomes unrest, a genocide becomes migration. They edited roots, redacted rage, and pacified the past until individuals no longer recognized the soil their spirit came from. The result, she posited, was a profound self-doubt, a questioning of one's own pain, and a perverse gratitude for having made it this far, unaware of how much was taken just to allow one to stand. Amnesia, she insisted, was their most powerful weapon, because if one couldn't remember the chains, one wouldn't recognize the cage. One would decorate it, defend it, pass it down. But Sarah offered a counter-narrative, a defiant act of remembering. She urged her audience to go to the libraries they were told were dangerous, to read the names they erased, to dig up the stories whispered only at kitchen tables and funerals, and to speak them aloud. Remembering, she declared, was rebellion, and memory was a blade that could not be dulled once drawn. Her script became a weaponization of history, not to instigate conflict, but to heal through confrontation, to reclaim a past that had been systematically stolen. It was a powerful call to collective memory, an assertion that the truth, however painful, was the only path to genuine liberation. The insidious lie of redemption by ruin became the focus of Sarah Jenkins' penultimate section. She dissected the narrative that suffering was redemptive, that salvation was a reward earned through prolonged pain, quiet tears, and convincing humility. This, she argued, was a twisted doctrine designed to break individuals and then rebuild them in the image of the system. They made you believe you were born broken, she wrote, and only through their system, their cleansing, their punishment, their purification, could you become whole again. This was the core of the Ravencrofts' manipulation, their promise of confluence, only after their victims were utterly shattered. Sarah meticulously revealed how this redemption by ruin was the doctrine of every empire, every tyrant, every manipulator who offered salvation only after they had shattered you. Their true goal, she asserted, was dependency, because if they could break you, they could rebuild you in their image. Her script became a powerful refutation of this lie, a declaration that individuals were not broken, never were. They were already whole, already worthy, already sacred. This truth, she insisted, terrified the architects of control, because if individuals walked away from their altars, their temples would crumble. She challenged the audience to remove the blade of deception, to reclaim the breath taxed with guilt, and to understand that every blessing not freely given was a leash. The truth, she declared, wouldn't kneel, wouldn't wear robes, wouldn't ask for silence. It only asked one to look at their hands and see they were never empty, only bound. This was a profound act of spiritual and psychological liberation, a final breaking of the mental and emotional chains that had held individuals captive for generations. The journey through the Ravencroft rituals, through Aris Thorne's descent, and through Sarah Jenkins' unwavering quest for truth, culminates here, in the echo of a forgotten silence. We began in 1862, with a horrific secret buried in the heart of a city consumed by war. We've unearthed the twisted philosophy of pain as salvation, the chilling pursuit of the architect, and the silent suppression that followed. We've seen how a desperate act of defiance sparked a chain reaction, leading us through layers of amnesia, hidden symbols, and the subtle machinery of control. From the physical horrors of the church to the digital prisons of algorithms, from the hymn of the hollow crowns to the ghost script of unwritten rules, we've witnessed the pervasive nature of an ancient system designed to manage perception and harvest obedience. We've confronted the Watchers, the Book of Forgotten Names, and the insidious lie of redemption by ruin. We've peeled back the veil of affection as control and challenged the illusion of choice. The true legacy of the Ravencroft rituals is not just a forgotten crime, but a terrifying blueprint, a stark reminder that the darkest corners of history are not always far removed from our present reality. It serves as a potent warning that control doesn't always come with fangs or fire. Sometimes it comes as comfort, as tradition, as the very fabric of the world we're taught to trust. So now, as this long descent comes to a close, a new question arises. What will you choose to remember? What truths will you dare to speak? The silence that once buried these horrors is cracking, but its shatter depends on you. Do you now recognize the architecture of control, the unseen hands that weave the narratives, the subtle whispers that shape your reality? The darkness we've uncovered is not meant to paralyze, but to awaken, to make you see, to make you question, to make you remember who you were before the guilt, the chains, the obedience wrapped in prayer. You were not born to serve machines built from scripture. You were not made to kneel before thrones of ash. You were made to question, to tear open the veil, to reclaim the silence. They gave you a name, now whisper your own. They gave you a book, now write over it. They gave you a God to fear. Now become the voice that unmakes that fear. This is your unlearning, your awakening, not to rebellion but to remembrance. So tell me in the comments, What do you believe was truly buried for 150 years? What forgotten silence is screaming for release in your own memory? If this journey through the shadows has opened your eyes, if it has made you remember, then don't let it disappear into the void. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts and, most importantly, subscribe to the Seventh Mark. Because what comes next will go even deeper.